They can feel that you don't need them anymore, and that single realization is quietly driving them out of their minds. Sit with that for a second before we continue, because I know what you want to do right now. You want to soften it, explain it away, tell yourself that surely nobody has noticed anything different, that you have not really changed all that much, that this is probably just your imagination working overtime. But you already know better than that. You have felt the shift in the way certain people reach out now, a little too quickly, a little too eager, checking in about nothing in particular, as if they are testing whether the line is still connected on your end. It is not your imagination. Something in you actually changed, and people who once orbited you out of habit are now circling back out of confusion, because the version of you they relied on used to need them in ways you no longer do. I want you to think about a lighthouse for a moment, because nothing explains what has happened to you quite as clearly. A lighthouse does not shine because ships are watching. It does not dim when the harbor goes quiet, and it does not brighten desperately when a boat drifts too far off course. It simply keeps its light burning, night after night, on its own schedule, for its own reasons, completely indifferent to whether anyone out there is even looking. That indifference is not coldness, it is the entire point. The lighthouse does its job regardless of audience. And paradoxically, that is exactly what makes it trustworthy enough for ships to actually rely on when they need it. For a long time, you were not operating like a lighthouse. You were operating like a signal flare, burning brightly and briefly, entirely dependent on someone noticing before you burned out completely. You needed the response. You needed the acknowledgement. You needed someone, anyone, to look over and confirm that your light was worth watching. And without that confirmation, you dimmed almost automatically, questioning whether you had ever really been shining at all. That dependency is gone now, not because you decided one day to stop caring about the people around you, but because something deeper recalibrated, and your light stopped requiring an audience to justify its own existence. You still care. You still want connection. But you no longer need the validation the way you used to, and that distinction, subtle as it sounds, has completely rearranged how people experience you. Here is what makes this so unsettling for them. People who benefited from your old need, whether they meant to or not, built entire relationships around your hunger for their attention. They could disappear for weeks and reappear with minimal effort, and you would still light up like nothing had happened, grateful simply to be noticed again. They could offer inconsistent affection, sporadic warmth followed by long, cold stretches, and you would absorb the inconsistency without much complaint, because any attention at all still felt like more than you expected to receive. Now that inconsistency lands completely differently. Now when they disappear, you simply continue. Now when they reappear, expecting the same grateful, eager version of you, they find someone calm instead. Someone whose entire mood does not shift based on whether they decided to show up today. And that calm terrifies them far more than anger ever could, because anger at least proves they still hold power over your emotional state. Calm proves the opposite. Calm proves the light was never actually depending on them in the first place. Look at your friendships for a moment, because this is where the shift becomes almost impossible to hide. There was a version of you that treated every friendship like a fragile flame, cupping your hands around it constantly, terrified that one wrong move might extinguish something you could not survive losing. You initiated every plan. You forgave every canceled dinner without question. You kept the group chats alive practically on your own, sending the check-ins nobody else bothered sending, absorbing the silence when your messages went unanswered for days, telling yourself it was fine, telling yourself you understood how busy everyone was. That version of you needed those friendships to prove something, that you were likable, that you were worth choosing, that if you just tried hard enough, consistently enough, people would eventually reciprocate the effort you had been pouring out for years. And some of them let you believe that for a very long time because your effort was convenient, and convenient things rarely get questioned by the people benefiting from them. You have stopped initiating quite so desperately now. Exactly. You still show up. You still care deeply, but you no longer manufacture connection out of thin air. just to avoid the discomfort of stillness. And the people who only maintained contact because you were doing all the maintaining are suddenly finding an unfamiliar silence where your relentless effort used to be. They are noticing gaps they never had to think about before because you used to fill every single one of them without being asked. Your romantic relationships carry this same signature, though it shows up with even sharper edges. You used to treat affection like something you had to earn through performance, bending yourself into whatever shape seemed most likely to be chosen, most likely to be kept. You minimized your needs. You apologized for feelings that deserved acknowledgement instead of apology. You accepted breadcrumbs and called them meals because a small amount of love from someone you desperately wanted still felt safer than the terrifying possibility of being alone with yourself. That performance has ended, and the people who benefited from your desperate effort can feel its absence immediately, even if they cannot name what changed. You no longer chase reassurance the way you used to. You no longer interpret someone's distance as evidence that you must have done something wrong. You have started sitting with uncertainty instead of scrambling to resolve it through anxious texts and rehearsed apologies nobody actually asked for. That stillness unnerves people who relied on your anxiety as their primary source of leverage, because anxious people are predictable, and predictable people are easy to keep on a very short leash without much effort at all. Now consider your career, because validation seeking shows up there in a shape most people never fully examine until it stops. There was a version of you that measured your entire worth by whether the right person noticed your effort. You stayed late hoping someone would see it. You over-explained your ideas in meetings, desperate for approval disguised as feedback, and every piece of praise, no matter how small, felt like oxygen you could not survive without. Every silence after a project felt like rejection, even when it was simply silence, nothing more, nothing less. That hunger has quieted considerably. You still care about doing excellent work, but you no longer need someone else's applause to confirm that the work was worth doing in the first place. You have started trusting your own internal sense of whether something is good, rather than outsourcing that judgment entirely to managers, colleagues, or clients who were never as invested in your growth as you assumed they were. And the people who used to dangle approval strategically, doling it out just often enough to keep you working twice as hard for half the recognition, are noticing that their old currency no longer buys the same effort. Indeed, their praise still feels nice. It simply no longer feels necessary. Your family expectations tell a similar story, one built over years rather than months. Families often assign you a role early and expect that role performed indefinitely, regardless of how much you have grown beyond it. You were the one who needed guidance, or the one who needed correcting, or the one whose choices required everyone else's approval before they could be considered valid. For a long time you sought that approval instinctively, calling home for reassurance about decisions you had already made, waiting for permission you did not actually require, treating disagreement from family as evidence that you must be wrong, rather than simply different. You stopped waiting for that permission, not loudly, not as a declaration, but quietly, the way a lighthouse stops caring whether the harbor master approves of the schedule it keeps. You make decisions now and inform people afterward, if at all, rather than seeking consensus beforehand out of habit. That shift unsettles people who built their identity around being your primary source of validation, because a lighthouse that no longer checks in with the harbor master before lighting up each night is a lighthouse that has quietly stopped needing permission to exist exactly as it is. Even your relationship with social media reveals this shift, in a smaller but still telling way. You used to check for reactions almost compulsively, refreshing notifications, measuring your day's value against numbers that meant nothing in any real sense. Now you post because you want to, or you do not post at all, and either way, the outcome barely registers. The engagement used to feel like proof you existed. Now existing simply feels sufficient on its own, with or without anyone confirming it through a screen. Then there is your self-talk, which might be the quietest transformation of all. and also the one that made every other shift possible in the first place. You used to speak to yourself the way a desperate person speaks to someone they are terrified of losing, careful, apologetic, constantly checking whether you had said too much, wanted too much, taken up more space than you were allowed. Your inner voice used to negotiate on your behalf with the world, softening your worth preemptively so that rejection, if it came, would not have to travel very far to reach you. That negotiation has mostly ended. There is a different voice inside you now, calmer, less apologetic, less interested in shrinking preemptively just to avoid the discomfort of taking up your rightful space. You still have doubts. Everyone does. But the constant background hum of not enough, too much, why would they choose you, has quieted into something closer to steady, unremarkable confidence. Exactly. Not arrogance, not performance, just a lighthouse, quietly certain of its own light, regardless of whether the harbor is watching tonight. Here is the deeper truth, sitting underneath everything we have covered so far. A lighthouse that stops needing an audience does not become less useful. It becomes more trustworthy, because now its light exists independent of circumstance, independent of whether the night is calm or violent, independent of whether a single ship happens to be looking in its direction. Ships that once took the lighthouse for granted, assuming it would always adjust its brightness according to their convenience, are now discovering that the light simply exists on its own terms, and either the ship adjusts its course to make use of it, or it does not, and the lighthouse remains completely unaffected either way. That is exactly what is happening to the people orbiting you right now. They built their entire approach around your old need for their attention, and that approach no longer produces the same predictable results. They are recalculating, testing old signals, wondering why the version of you that used to light up so easily at the smallest gesture no longer responds the same way. Some of them will adjust and meet you at this new, steadier place. Others will drift entirely, unable to function without a version of you that required their constant management. Both outcomes are perfectly fine, because a lighthouse was never meant to chase the boats that wander away from its light in the first place. What they are actually reacting to, underneath all their confusion, is the quiet realization that they no longer hold the leverage they assumed was permanent, and leverage, once lost, rarely returns in the same form. You did not become distant to punish anyone. You did not stop needing them as some calculated strategy. You simply stopped abandoning yourself in order to keep other people comfortable, and comfort, once removed from someone who benefited from your self-abandonment, always looks like coldness to the very people who never had to work for your warmth before. Let us go even deeper into what this actually means, because there is a layer here most people never stop to examine closely enough. A lighthouse standing quietly on its own, needing nothing from the ships passing in the distance, is not simply indifferent to them. It is proving something far more important, that its light was always self-sustaining, that it never actually required their attention to keep burning in the first place. That truth was there the entire time, hidden underneath years of you believing the opposite, believing your worth depended on being watched, chosen, chased, or reassured. Think about how strange that old belief actually was, once you see it clearly. Somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that your value needed external confirmation to be considered real, as if a lighthouse could somehow stop being a lighthouse the moment nobody happened to be sailing past it that particular night. But a lighthouse never actually depended on the ships. The ships depended on the lighthouse, quietly, whether they acknowledged it or not. And the moment you understood that dynamic in reverse, everything about how you moved through relationships began to shift. You are no longer waiting for permission to shine exactly as bright as you already are. That is the entire transformation in a single sentence. You see the old pattern now for exactly what it was: self-abandonment disguised as generosity, anxiety disguised as devotion, desperation disguised as love. And once you see a pattern clearly enough to name it, it permanently loses its grip on you, because self-abandonment depends entirely on you remaining unaware that you are the one doing it to yourself. So here is what I need you to sit with as we move toward the end of this. You are not required to explain why your light no longer flickers for people who only valued it when it was unstable. You are not required to apologize for a steadiness that makes certain people uncomfortable in a dynamic they used to fully control. You are not required to dim yourself back down just because your quiet confidence removed the leverage someone else had grown far too comfortable using against you. None of that discomfort belongs to you. Let them sit with it. Let them recalculate. Let them test the old signals as many times as they need to, because none of it is going to work the same way twice, and somewhere beneath their confusion, they already sense that. You are the lighthouse that stopped needing the harbor's approval to keep burning. You are the version of yourself that no longer measures your own worth by who happens to be looking tonight. You are unreadable only to people who mistook your old desperation for your actual personality. Only to people who confused your anxiety with affection and your self-abandonment with love. To anyone paying real attention, you were never actually cold at all. You were simply learning, slowly and steadily, how to shine without needing an audience to make it feel real, and it only looks sudden to the people who were too comfortable benefiting from your old need to notice the process happening the whole time. So stop dimming yourself back down just because your steady light unsettles someone standing in a harbor they used to control so effortlessly. Stop over-explaining a calm that was never anyone else's decision to approve of in the first place. Stop apologizing for no longer needing people who only valued you when you needed them desperately in return. None of that guilt belongs to you anymore. Hand it back. Let them stand out there in the dark, recalculating, testing old signals, waiting for a flicker that is not coming, because somewhere beneath their confusion, they already sense the truth of what changed. You are the lighthouse that stopped needing the harbor to justify its light. You are the version of yourself that finally stopped abandoning your own needs just to keep someone else comfortable. You are unreadable only to people who never really knew you, only to people who mistook your desperation for devotion and your anxiety for love. To anyone paying real attention, you were never actually distant at all. You were simply becoming, quietly and steadily, exactly the kind of light that does not require permission to keep burning, and it only looks sudden to the people who were too busy benefiting from your old need to notice the process happening the entire time. Let this be the moment you stop asking permission to shine at your own steady brightness. Let this be the moment you stop feeling guilty for a peace nobody can manipulate their way into ever again. You do not owe anyone a warning before your light stabilizes. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the calm that replaced your old desperation. The only thing you owe yourself now is the follow-through, the discipline to keep choosing this steadier version of you even on the nights it feels lonely. Even on the nights the old chase would be so much easier to fall back into than this hard-won stillness. They can keep watching from the harbor, waiting for the old flicker, the old desperation, the old you who would eventually burn brighter the moment they finally noticed. It is not coming back. That light does not dim for old signals anymore. What is burning now belongs entirely to you, steady, self-sustaining, and finally out of reach of anyone who only ever valued what your desperation could offer them. You were never meant to stay dependent on being noticed. You were only ever meant to become exactly this. And now that you have nothing they do, say, or remember about who you used to be can pull that old flicker back out of you again. If this found you at the right moment, drop the word "still shining" in the comments so I know it landed. And if you needed to hear this today, stay a little longer. There is more where this came from.